Roch Thériault was born in 1947 in Saguenay, Quebec. By his late 20s, he had drifted through odd jobs, failed businesses, and a brief but intense involvement with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, from which he was eventually expelled. What he took with him was a charismatic preaching style, a habit of quoting scripture from memory, and an apocalyptic conviction that the modern world was rotting from the inside. In 1977, he founded a small community in the Laurentian Mountains north of Quebec City. He called himself Moses, and told his followers that the end of the world would arrive in February 1979. They were chosen, he said. They would survive. Everyone else would not. Roughly a dozen adults followed him. They sold their belongings. They cut contact with their families. They moved into wooden cabins with no running water and no electricity. They worked the land, baked bread, and made handcrafted goods to sell at roadside stands. To outsiders, they looked like a back-to-the-land commune, a little eccentric, a little intense, but not dangerous. That outside appearance was the first illusion. Inside the compound, Thériault had already begun rewriting reality. He renamed every adult. He assigned them roles. He decided who would have children with whom. And here's what most people miss about cults of this kind. The abuse does not arrive all at once. It arrives in inches. By the time anyone notices, the floor beneath them has already moved. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost no one predicts, because when the apocalypse Thériault promised never arrived, the group did not fall apart. They grew tighter. We will get to why in a moment, and it is one of the most counterintuitive findings in cult psychology. When February 1979 came and went without an apocalypse, Thériault did not apologize. He did not even explain. He simply moved the goalposts and told his followers that God had granted humanity a reprieve because of them. This is a classic pattern. Researchers who study apocalyptic groups call it prophecy adjustment, and it almost always strengthens the group rather than weakening it. The followers have already given up everything. To admit the prophecy was false would be to admit they destroyed their old lives for nothing. So they doubled down. They believe harder. By the early 1980s, Thériault had relocated the commune to a remote property near Burnt River in rural Ontario. The move was practical. Quebec child welfare authorities had begun asking questions about the children being born inside the compound. Ontario, he calculated, would be quieter. He was right. For nearly a decade, the group lived almost entirely off-grid. They were largely invisible to the wider world. During those years, Thériault tightened his control. He claimed exclusive sexual access to the women in the group. He fathered more than 20 children with multiple followers. He banned outside medical care. He decided who ate and who did not. He decided who slept and who did not. He performed what he called surgeries and dental work on his own followers, with no training, no anesthetic, and no medical instruments worthy of the name. In 1988, one of the women, Solange Boilard, died after one of these so-called procedures. Her death was not reported to authorities. The group buried her on the property. Without that act of concealment, the case might have ended very differently, and the forensic record left behind by that single decision would later become central to the prosecution. That is the half of the story most retellings stop at. But the next part, how the case actually came to light, is where most people get this completely wrong. The common assumption is that police raided the commune, rescued everyone, and built the case from the inside out. That is not what happened. The case began with one woman walking alone out of the woods. Her name was Gabrielle Lavallee. She had been part of the group for years. In the summer of 1989, she had suffered a catastrophic injury at Thériault's hands, an injury that, without immediate hospital care, would have killed her. She made the decision that almost no long-term cult member ever makes. She left. When she walked into a hospital in Ontario, she initially refused to identify Thériault. This is the hardest part of cult investigations for outsiders to understand. The fear is not only physical. After years of indoctrination, a follower may genuinely believe that betraying the leader will damn them spiritually. She told doctors a partial story. She named no one, but hospital staff filed the report as Canadian law required. Ontario Provincial Police began making quiet inquiries. They drove out to the property. They spoke to other members. They noticed children with untreated injuries. They noticed adults who would not make eye contact. They noticed the careful, rehearsed quality of every answer. Investigators worked the case the way they would work any organized crime file. They identified the leader. They identified the inner circle. They identified the witnesses most likely to break. They moved slowly because they understood that the moment Thériault realized he was being investigated, evidence and potentially people would disappear. The forensic breakthrough came when investigators were finally able to recover the remains of Solange Boilard. The condition of those remains and the location of her burial corroborated the survivor testimony in a way that no defense could explain away. This is something the public rarely appreciates about cult prosecutions. Survivor accounts alone are almost never enough. Defense lawyers will attack memory, motive, mental state. What convicts a cult leader is physical evidence that matches the survivor's words. Burnt River gave investigators exactly that. Theriault was arrested. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Solange Boilard and was sentenced to life in prison with no parole eligibility for 10 years. He was also convicted of multiple counts of aggravated assault. The children were removed and placed in care. The compound was shut down. But the question that haunted the investigators was not how he was caught. It was how he had not been caught sooner. And the answer to that takes us into the psychology of the case. Roch Theriault was assessed by multiple psychiatrists and forensic psychologists over the course of his life. The consensus diagnosis pointed to severe antisocial personality traits combined with grandiose narcissism, a profile that is, on its own, not rare. What made his case clinically significant was not the diagnosis. It was the method. Cult researchers identify a small number of recurring tools that high-control groups use to dismantle individual identity. Theriault used nearly all of them. Isolation from family, renaming of members, sleep deprivation, food control, forced confessions, rotating sexual partners, public humiliation, unpredictable punishment. The pattern is so consistent across unrelated cults, from rural North America to urban Japan to South Korea, that researchers suspect it emerges almost by instinct in certain personality types. A coercive leader does not need to be taught these techniques. They reinvent them. The forward question, the one we promised at the start, how does an entire group lose the ability to leave, has a measurable answer. Psychologists call it traumatic bonding. When a person experiences cycles of cruelty and intermittent kindness from the same source, the brain begins to crave the kindness rather than escape the cruelty. The bond becomes stronger, not weaker, with each cycle. Add a closed environment, shared children, total economic dependence, and a belief system that frames every outside person as an enemy, and you have a structure that is almost impossible to walk out of alone. This is why Gabrielle Lavallee's decision to walk out of those woods matters so much. It was not just a survival decision. It was a statistical outlier. Most long-term members of high-control groups do not self-extract. They are extracted by family interventions, by police, by collapse of the group from within. She left under her own power, while still injured, while still afraid, while still in many ways psychologically inside the group. Here is the comment trigger I want to throw to you. If you have ever known someone who was pulled into something, a relationship, a job, a group, that they could not seem to leave even when it was clearly hurting them, drop a single word in the comments. Just one. Because understanding that pattern is the first step to recognizing it. Roch Theriault was denied parole repeatedly. In February 2011, he was killed in his prison cell by another inmate. He never expressed meaningful remorse. The surviving members of the Ant Hill Kids and the children born inside the group have spent decades rebuilding lives that were never theirs to begin with. CTA 12-0013-00. If cases like this one, cases where the warning signs were there but nobody connected them in time, are the ones you find yourself thinking about days later, that is exactly what this channel is built around. CrimeDossier is a small operation. We go deep on cases the mainstream documentaries either rush through or sensationalize, and we try to give victims their dignity back in the telling. If that matters to you, hit subscribe. It is genuinely the one thing that lets us keep doing this work. The next file is already on the table. Outro 13-00-15-00. There is a tendency when we talk about cases like the Ant Hill Kids to focus on the man at the center, the leader, the monster, the face on the file. But the people who study these cases for a living will tell you something unsettling. They will tell you that the leader is almost never the most interesting question. The interesting question is the structure, the conditions, the slow, almost invisible architecture by which an ordinary person, a neighbor, a friend, a family member, ends up somewhere they would never have chosen to go. Roch Theriault did not recruit followers by promising them suffering. He recruited them by promising them meaning. He offered certainty in a decade of uncertainty. He offered family to people who felt alone. He offered purpose to people who felt invisible. The cruelty came later when leaving had already become unthinkable. That is the lesson forensic psychologists keep returning to in the Ant Hill Kids file. Not that evil is loud, but that it is often, in its early stages, indistinguishable from belonging. Gabrielle Lavallee survived. She wrote a memoir. She spoke publicly. She did the harder thing. She turned what was done to her into a warning for other people. That, more than any conviction, is what kept the case alive. If this one stayed with you, my breakdown of the Order of the Solar Temple, the Quebec and Switzerland cult that ended in mass deaths just a few years after the Burnt River investigation, will land very differently after what you just heard. The patterns are not a coincidence. The card is on screen now. In 1989, a woman walked out of the Ontario woods with injuries no one could explain and uncovered one of the most disturbing cult cases in Canadian history. This is the full story of Rock Theriault and the Ant Hill Kids, how a charismatic apocalyptic preacher from Quebec built a closed commune, fathered more than 20 children inside it, and operated for nearly a decade before a single survivor's decision brought everything down. We trace the investigation by the Ontario Provincial Police, the forensic evidence that corroborated survivor testimony, the 1993 conviction, and the criminal psychology that explains how groups like this trap their members. No graphic content, this is a case study in coercive control, traumatic bonding, and the warning signs that were missed. 00, 00, the woman who walked out of the woods, 00, 45, who was Rock Theriault, 03, 00, when the apocalypse never came, 06, 00, how one survivor cracked the case, 09, 00, the psychology of total control, 12, 00, what this case reveals, 13, 00, final reflection, true crime, cold case, crime documentary, criminal psychology, Ant Hill Kids.